You didn't just move to New York. You moved to Manhattan. I know you did. If you're using Seamless, because we actually beat Seamless in Brooklyn and Hoboken. Like it was only Manhattan. And so we had blocked them from pretty much every other city in the United States, but they had more orders in Manhattan than we had in the rest of the country combined. Like it was that much. It was that big in Manhattan.
Welcome to another episode of Creator Lab. We have a special guest here today, Mike Evans. Welcome to the show, my man.
Hey, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
All right, so Mike, I'm going to do a quick background on you, but tell me where I'm missing out some ideas here about your background. So you're the founder or the co-founder of Grubhub. A lot of people in the US would have already heard of Grubhub. Was a public company, got acquired, I think, 2020 by Just Eat in Europe now. But we kind of like led the way in delivery, right? So all of us now who use either Seamless, DoorDash, Uber Eats, Grubhub, depending on wherever you are, or in Europe, you might be using Deliveroo, Just Eat, etc. We all are used to this behavior nowadays, but in 2002, it was not really a thing in the way that it has now become. So that is kind of a quick background on what you've done in the past, or what you created in the past. So today we're going to be talking a lot about that journey. Over 20 years, you've learned a lot of stuff. You've also got a book that's coming out right now called Hangry. Great name for a book, by the way. So yeah, that is it. And then I know you also got another company, Fixer.com. So was there anything else I was missing out?
No, I think that's it. Grubhub wrote a book about it called Hangry, started Fixer.
There we go.
That's happy to talk. So that's it. That's a wrap. That's the whole show.
Yeah, all right. Nice. Thanks for coming on, man. That was great.
But maybe we could dive in on a couple of those ideas, and I think it'll be fun.
Let's do it. So look, man. So you're in Chicago right now. I know Grubhub. There's a cool story about how Grubhub actually started. So I'd love to just kick this off by going back to 2002. You're in your apartment. You want to order a pizza. Now, tell me a little bit more about what happened from there.
I think you just told the whole story. I was in my apartment. I wanted pizza. I mean, this is how a lot of startups actually get started, right? Like I wanted a pizza. And at the time you couldn't even find the restaurants that delivered to you online. Like you had to go look in the yellow pages. So like Google didn't really, I don't even know if it had launched or it wasn't big yet, but like you had Yahoo and MSN, there was no real delivery guides. And so at the time, you couldn't even find the restaurants to deliver to you. You certainly couldn't find their menus. And online ordering was the only time it had ever come up in sort of the collective consciousness was in the 1998 movie, The Net, with Sandra Bullock, where she placed an online order for pizza. But it didn't actually exist yet. Domino's had just started experimenting with online ordering, but it didn't exist. And so I wanted a pizza. And so the first thing I did is I built a delivery guide. I wasn't thinking about ordering, wasn't thinking about transactions. It wasn't a business. It was just a hobby. I just created a delivery guide to find all the restaurants that delivered to my address. And so that's how it started. I did that and kind of ran it for about a year as a hobby before my co-founder sold the first restaurant. And then I quit like a week later and decided to like do it as a business.
Go full time. And so just to paint a picture, what were you doing before Grubhub? It sounded like you were doing this on the side for a while. You had a job, it sounded like?
I did have a job. I'm a software developer by background. Yeah. So I was writing software for a company called Home Finder, which was sort of basically was trying to replace the classified sections in a newspaper. I mean, this is how long ago it was, right?
Well, what's crazy is that theme is something I've talked about quite a lot on the show. And I had a guy called Fabrice Grindo on the show who is invested in 500 marketplace startups. And their whole thesis is basically look at, Gumtree in the UK or Craigslist, in the US, and like look at every single category. And that's how like Airbnb kind of came out of something like that too, right? It's actually a great place to look for ideas. Like people are still using these sites. And nowadays, I mean, there's Facebook Marketplace and stuff as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely true. My new business, Fixer, which is an on-demand handy person service, like you can find that section in Craigslist. I actually think there's a better model. We're going to go off the script here a little bit. There's a better model for figuring out what business you want to do. You take two of the deadly sins, right? So like, and then you just figure out what the business model is for them. So Grubhub is gluttony and sloth, right? So like you pick two deadly sins and there's a business model. And some of those like wrath and lust, you probably don't want to get into, but like if you just take 2 of the 7, there's a business model there somewhere. I say that sort of tongue in cheek, but it was true that like we were enabling people, you know, if you spin it positively, we're enabling people to get food through convenience. If you spin it negatively, we're enabling people to be lazy and eat chicken wings.
Yeah.
Right? So like whatever you want to say, but like, yeah, this is a different
nothing
way.
Wrong with chicken wings, man. Well, Mike, I think that we are going off script here, but I kind of like the idea. So let's roll with it a little bit. I'm going to pull up the 7 deadly sins. I'm just trying to kind of solidify that thought, because let's think of companies that are in each category. So there's lust, gluttony, greed, sloth, wrath, envy, pride. So lust, I feel like there's a few dating apps.
I mean, lust and pride is Instagram, right?
That's true. Okay, that's a good point.
Like,
so, maybe TikTok in parts as well. Yeah. Would you put like dating app or like dating app in air quotes in the lust category as well?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, you could also just talk about it positively. You could talk about connection and shelter, right?
That's
might
true.
be Airbnb, right? So
that's true. That's true.
It's sort of tongue in cheek, but there's lots of ways to think about business ideas, right? And even the idea of Grubhub, like people had the idea for years before anything happened with it. And I actually had the idea for the website. The person, Matt, who became my co-founder, we had talked about the idea a full year before I started coding it up as a hobby. Like It was an idea for a long time, but it's actually the action of taking it from the idea and creating something from nothing that really is the creative process. Like the ideas are a dime a dozen. And so that's why I sort of talk jokingly about whether it's unbundling Craigslist or talking about the 7 deadly sins or whatever. It doesn't actually really matter. There's lots of ideas out there. It's the creation that really matters.
Yeah. And so I'm curious to go into that moment though for a little bit. So you said you had this idea before. I'm assuming you and your friends, were you the sort of friend groups that were like talking about ideas all the time? Because I think of my friends, not all my friends, 'cause some of us just talk about football, right? But like a lot of us, we're sitting there, we're like, oh, it'll be cool to do this in this space. Or, oh, have you seen this new macro trend of, you know, how could it be applied, or this new technology or this new user behavior? So I'm curious, like, is that kind of what you were like with your friend, like especially your co-founder?
You know, I think what it was is the people that I talked about with it, one of them was my boss at Home Finder. Another one was Matt, who was a coworker. He was a sysadmin at the company that I worked at. And there was a couple other people, and we were talking about ideas for businesses, because the idea of working for yourself is powerful compared to just being just a developer at a company. And for me, especially, that was a big motivator for leaving. Like, my job was fine. My boss was fine. The company was fine. All those things they were fine. I didn't have a big problem with them. I got paid okay. Like, it was good. But the idea that like I'm just a developer and I can't like think about marketing, or I'm just a developer and I can't think about product or sales, that really bothered me. I hated the
boxing you in sort of thing,
being pigeonholed like that.
Yeah.
I didn't like that feeling. It made me chafe. Like I wanted to get out and do something on my own. And so that was a big part of the motivation for leaving. Was I wanted to get away from the rat race, right? That was a part of it.
Yeah.
There was a pull too, which was, I found this thing that actually is really valuable to me. Like being able to get a pizza, there's a real idea here, and the executions, I can see a path where this could be a real business. And so there was a push and a pull to leaving the company and leaving my dated 9-to-5 job and going and starting my own thing.
Completely. And just again, to paint a picture for younger listeners who might have been 4 years old in 2002, right? So like 2002, you said Google was maybe around, but it wasn't like what it became, obviously. And like even just the behavior of people on the internet, like people were searching on Yahoo, and I think it was like Lycos and stuff like that. But really, like the style of the internet back then, from what I remember anyway, and I could be slightly off with my timing here, was just more like a directory. Like if you remember, like the AOL page, and like, or like even Yahoo for a long time, basically just had like a directory, like it was different categories, right? So
you'd browse instead of searching.
Browse and search, exactly. And now we have feeds where things come to us, essentially. Yeah. So I'm curious though, and this was obviously before the iPhone. We're going to get to mobile and iPhone a little bit later, but this was just, desktop computers, really. Now at this time, if you start telling people you've got this idea, normally what happens at that stage is there's a few kind of optimists that are like, oh, wow, yeah, that sounds like a really cool idea. Like, I'd love to use that. But a lot of people are like, oh, it can't work for this reason, or it's going to be too expensive. And how do you get it to someone's house? And what happens when someone has an accident on the way, bring it to a customer, or they get food poisoning, then you're going to get sued. So I'm curious, like, first of all, is that accurate? From your experience, people kind of saying all the negatives of basically all the problems that still need to be solved versus, the other side, which is like what it might be one day.
Yeah, I think there's always naysayers for sure. And I have I could talk about 8 different things from just that prompt, but like one of the things that comes to mind is I have a very strong response to hey, there's a lot of other problems here. And it's actually the nature of creating a startup or innovating generally that you have some big problem. Call it like the big primary problem. For me, it was I can't find the restaurants that deliver to me. And there's a solution to that problem, which is, okay, I'm going to make a delivery guide that shows people that where they can get what restaurants to deliver to their address, right? And so that's the solution to that problem. But the solution itself creates a series of other problems. But there's something really important about this. There's a lot of them, and every single one of them is smaller than the original problem you were trying to solve. And so this like iteration of finding a problem, finding a solution for it, that solution creating problems that you then have to find solution for, which then create problems that you then have to find solutions for, and so on and so on and so on forever. That is the nature of innovating. And so like, yes, like I created a delivery guide, and then I wanted to do it full time. So I had to sell people. And then I started selling restaurants. And that created another problem, which is the restaurants wanted proof that it worked. And so what I ended up doing is I ended up creating a telecom server. I wrote the software for it where like I got a bunch of phone numbers from like AT&T, right? I got like 1,000 phone numbers, and they came into my server. And then I forwarded those calls onto the restaurants. I told people that, this call is being recorded for quality. And then I would go to the restaurants and I could say, hey, look, you got 48 calls last month. It's worth the $100 a month you're paying. And so the solution was the problem created this, the solution to the I can't find delivery created this problem, which then I created the solution for, which then led me towards a different thing, which was, why am I charging $100 a month? Why don't I just charge $2 an order? Since I'm already recording the calls. And there was a necessary thing. This was probably like 2005. This was like the first evolution of the business, was going from charging restaurants a subscription price for just exposure to this transactional model. There was a thing, like I say in the book, which was I should have started with online ordering. And that was like 2 years later, because I did this whole phone-based thing to start. But it's also important to remember that in 2005, people were nervous about putting their credit card number into a web page, which
My
is
mom
like
still
kind of hard to imagine
doing
now.
it today.
Yeah,
I was talking to it today.
It's not a problem now. And other things changed too. You couldn't call a restaurant and sell them an idea, but Groupon changed that for everybody. Like Groupon called so many restaurants so many times.
They got so used to
they opened up the door behavior for phone-based sales to small businesses. So things changed during the course of the business. But the thing that stayed the same was this: like, you have to constantly be solving the problems that your business creates to make it a better product.
Yeah, completely. No, that was really cool to go into that. So I do kind of want to revisit that idea again a little bit later when we talk about mobile, because I think that was quite a specific change that maybe you saw it coming, but most people didn't see the scale of it changing so quickly. So let's get into that in a second, because that obviously changed delivery for people and our behavior. Let's go into that moment about like actually quitting your job and knowing when that time was, when it was the right time to do that, because a lot of us go through that, not always quitting a job to go into a company, but just moving on to the next thing. So I'm curious, like, how did you know it was the right time for you personally to go full time into that?
So the moment was, so my business partner, I had made this business as this thing as a hobby, right? And Matt sold the first restaurant. He sold a restaurant for $140 for 6 months of exposure, and like came back and handed me the $140 check, and I was like, oh, like this, someone has paid for this. This just went from being a hobby to a business. I can jump in and do this full time now. And part of it was I was looking for a reason to leave, right? But that would have just been giving up, right? I wasn't just looking for a reason to leave something. I wanted to look at something to go to. Like I needed to be jumping off of something towards something, moving towards something. And so that's that moment of like, I can make a run at this. I can go and sell a bunch of restaurants. I'm gonna have to sell like crazy to make enough money to just eat. But like put me in, coach. I want to do it. Like there was that moment. And I asked everyone in my life about whether or not this is a good idea. All the people that cared about, and they all said no, except for my wife, Christine, who said yes. And I say something about like in startups, we talk a lot about making data oriented or data underlying decisions, data aware decisions. Right. And so, making a decision without having any data on what you're trying to decide about it is just stupid. Making a decision with the data is really smart. Making a decision in spite of the data is visionary. Or it's truly stupid. It's one of the, it really just depends on whether it works or not. Right?
Yeah, that's true.
But like, everyone told me it was a bad idea. And I was like, I'm doing it anyway. I don't care. I'm going for it.
And how old were you at this stage?
I was 26.
And if you don't mind me asking, whatever you're happy to share, did you build up like some savings that you felt like a safety net? Because I think that is one of the things that people can't just completely gloss over, which is sometimes, well, first of all, it depends on your risk appetite and your personal life circumstances. If you're looking after a sick parent or a sick kid, or you literally are in 200 grand debt and you are going to be in 400 grand debt in 2 years because of crazy interest rates or something, it probably is a good idea to find a way to earn money before you take a big leap in most cases. But I'm curious for you, like what were the things that you were thinking about on the practical side?
Yeah, I think certainly it's the case that like a lot of people have responsibilities and sometimes they're taking care of ailing parents or kids or whatever. And it can be really hard to take a risk because of those obligations. The school debt one's an interesting one because I was in that situation. I had 260 grand in school debt.
Oh, damn.
At the time I quit. And so I'd been working for 2 years after I left MIT and I had saved up. By the time I quit, I had $13,000. And my business partner, Matt, also put in $13,000. So that was it. It was 26 grand that we put into the business. And then I had a 401k, which is like a retirement plan in the United States. So I cashed that in for 10 grand and I paid the 20, whatever the taxes were plus the 15 or 20% penalty. I don't remember on that. And so I had 260 grand in school debt and I had enough money if I stopped paying my loans back to make it like 3 months before like I was just out of money.
Damn.
And I went, it was a terrible decision and it really worked out well. But like, I mean, I think that there's a point to this. I said to my wife, like, we're 260 grand in school debt. We're going to be paying this until 2036. And this was in 2006, 2006 or 2035. This is in 2005. And like, that still hasn't even happened. And I was like, what does it matter if that moves to 2038 or 2041? Who cares? Like,
it's really hard to think that far out
forever.
At that age, right?
So it doesn't matter. They're always going to come for us. Like, let's just I can't even fathom what it's going to be like to actually be debt free at some point. But this thing, if it really works, might pay that off.
And it looks like it did. So
it did. I overshot.
So congrats
it worked out real well.
Well, so let's fast forward a little bit because we've got quite a lot to talk about. First of all, thanks for also sharing those details because I think actually putting a number on things. Obviously, this 2002, we're in a different climate right now. We're basically going into recession. It's like 10% inflation, and like the purchasing power of dollar was a bit different back then. But still, on the flip side, 250 grand in debt is like the equivalent of like 500 grand debt now or something like that. So, or like 400 or whatever. So that's a crazy amount of money.
It was like a house.
It was like, it's a crazy amount of money. So, so I'm curious to go into, when it started working. So you've got that 3-month period. What were the things you guys were doing in that period to actually move things forward? And when did you start seeing like this is actually working?
So what I did is I just went out and tried sales. I had it was a subscription product at the time. $100 a month is what we were charging for just exposure on this website. And so I would go from door to door in restaurants and I'd try and sign them up for the product. But because I had to like pay myself so I could eat, I would say, hey, if you sign up for 6 months and pay now, I'll give you 50% off. And I was just trying to get enough cash to like pay for groceries that week. Like you talk about being hungry for a startup. This was literal hunger. Like I wasn't like metaphorically hungry. If I didn't sell, I wasn't going to eat. And it turned out that that wasn't a problem because I would also get free food from the restaurants. So like eating actually turned out to be not a problem, but I still had to pay rent and all of those things. And so it was a big motivator. And one of the things I gloss over this detail a little bit in the book, but like, you know, I talk about that hustle, what it took to like just get restaurants to sign up. But then occasionally a restaurant would say, like, can you make a website for me? I'd be like, yeah, I can do that. That'll get me another 5 days of paying myself, and it'll take me 6 hours to do. So like it's a good trade-off. And that'll get me 4 more days.
Do you remember how much you charge for like a website?
I would charge like $1,000 to like make a website, but I would do it quick. I would do it in a couple hours. I mean, I was a software developer, so it didn't take me a long time.
Isn't it crazy how many people, have you got a lot of friends? I feel like there's a lot of people I've interviewed on here that sold websites, sold stuff on eBay, sold stuff at school, which wasn't always legal depending on who you speak to. There's always like, I mean, because they were obviously like quite easy things to do if you've got the skills. I used to do the same with websites and selling clothes at school and stuff as well.
I found out actually that setting up networks for people's small offices work. So I set up a couple networks for you could probably charge
a bit more than $1,000
it was like
for that.
$2,000. It wasn't that much. I mean, plus the materials. But my point being that like, so one of the things I did early on is I assigned a dollar rate for my time. So I paid myself $20 an hour for working on Grubhub. And I had to make enough cash to be able to pay that. But if I could charge somebody $50 an hour for like 10 hours of time, I would do that 10 hours of work and it would earn me 15 hours of working on my website. So like it was a real hustle to start. Like I was just trying to it's called arbitrage. I was trying anytime I could get paid more on a job that allowed me to spend the time on getting Grubhub to work, it worked. The other thing is you can only sell restaurants really between like 1 and 4 p.m. Like they're not there in the mornings. You can't go on the lunch rush. You can't go at dinner. So I really only had 3 hours a day that I could sell. So using that time to like make websites or work on the Grubhub website itself or whatever, like in the evenings, like it actually worked out pretty well.
Yeah, that's interesting because if you think of like lessons in air quotes people talk about, one was, you know, like you just said there, assigning a dollar value to your time. And I even think this is worth people doing. Like when you're trading, like you're doing a straight up startup where you're trying to grow to a big, you know, huge exit or a big success. Like even for someone like me who's kind of in between, where I've got my own company, but it's not a like startup, it's an agency essentially. So for me, I'm always working out the arbitrage and the trade-off to say, do I take on another 2 clients or do I get to have that time to work on other stuff, or even honestly just have free time that I value for other reasons. And I think, but if you don't have that kind of written out, so to speak, like with actual numbers, it's very difficult to make that decision in the moment. So I think that's actually a worthwhile exercise for people doing. Is there anything you did, like you just said $20 an hour, like was that just like a made up number or is that actually what you were getting paid from the company?
No, I assigned myself $20 an hour. That's what I it was helpful because if it took me 10 hours to get a restaurant signed up, that I could say, well, that was $200, right? So if the restaurant only made me $150, that's not a good use of my time, right? And so it became very, very apparent very quickly that signing somebody up for 6 months at a time for getting half off, and it cost me $200 to do that, I made $100 profit. But actually, if I get a repeat purchase from that customer, like for like 1 hour of time, that was really profitable. And it drove me to think about like the math behind where do I spend my time? What do I do? Where does my effort get me the most benefit? The other thing it did is it made me start charging ever higher rates for the things I was doing not related to Grubhub. So as Grubhub started to make more money, so when I got up to like $4,000 a month worth of subscriptions, which took about 10 months, the rate I would charge to do non-Grubhub work went from like $50 an hour to like $150 an hour. And I had what I kind of called the FU rate, which was the rate I quote to people where if they said yes, I had no choice but to just go do the work. And actually the last thing I did that wasn't Grubhub was a network setup. And I was like, yeah, I'll do it for you, but I charge $200 an hour. And it's probably going to take me like 40 hours. And they're like, great, can you come up tomorrow? And I was like, yes, I guess I can. Because then that $8,000 or whatever it was, like that set me up for 2 months of work at Grubhub to like get the thing spinning, right? It extended how long. And I think this experience is a lot more typical. It almost sounds like it almost sounds like this magical thing that like nobody does, because there's a narrative that in Silicon Valley where like I went to school and I got an MBA, and then I created a PowerPoint presentation. I showed it to a bunch of investors and they gave me $1 million, or they get this friends and family money, which like, what the hell is that? I don't have friends and family who have $1 million. Like, who does? Right. Well, I do now because I made it, but like, like this idea of like, that's how businesses start usually, is with like, I had a problem, I solved it, and then I hustled. Right. And
what I love about yours is you directly went to your eventual customers and they were validating your idea, not with just nice words, but actual money. And I think there's the other podcast I do is called Not Investment Advice with a friend of mine called Jack and Trung. And Jack is kind of famous for saying this on the internet, like, make your first dollar on the internet and it kind of will change your life. Because when you actually make that transaction, it hits your account. Like, there's a feeling you get, which is, oh, like someone actually cared about something I put out. And normally that compounds a lot more than $1, but it's just the idea of not, you could convince people all the time and like they can say, oh yeah, that'll be something I want in the future. But until they actually transact with you, that is the greatest like test, right? Like, did they actually give up something that they worked hard for something that you're offering?
There's a huge gap between $0 and $1.
Yeah,
and there's another huge gap between $1 from a customer and another dollar from that same customer. So when somebody finds enough value in what you did to repeat purchase, then you've really hit something valuable.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great frame actually for that. Yeah. So yeah, that's a great, because you often hear people say, going from 0 to 1 to N or whatever is like two different people a lot of the time. But like that idea of like 0 to 1 is incredibly hard, but getting someone to do repeat purchase is you're like, oh, actually they really like it. Like they didn't just make a mistake, so that's interesting. All right. To fast forward a little bit, because we could be talking about all the details here for a long time. Let's go fast forward to 2007. The iPhone is just announced in the summer. I think Steve Jobs is on stage. He tells us one more thing, and he eventually changes the world with this device that we all have in our pockets right now. But what a lot of people don't know is there was a difference between the summer of 2007 when the iPhone was announced and then the App Store, which a lot of us are just used to them being together, which actually came the next year in 2008. So with that frame of all of us ordering, from our phones, ordering a pizza as we do right now on the App Store, or using apps that were made on the App Store, take me back to that time, because it sounds like you guys were doing something a little bit different. You were actually like thinking about this in a creative way.
So July 2007 is when the iPhone comes out. So just prior to that, like it was either Q1 or Q2 2007. So either March or June. I remember the board meeting where this was, at this point, we had already gotten some investors. We were growing. We were in 8 cities. We probably had like 7,000 to 8,000 restaurants signed up on the platform, right? Like it was quite a bit further along from like just hustling, right? And I remember the board meeting where our first investor said to me, Mike, like, I feel like people use these Blackberries and these Palm Trios a lot. Like, what do you think about ordering on one of those? And I was like, it'll never happen. We're never going to use our phones to like order food. It's too clunky. Like, and I was thinking like text message ordering, like no way. And then Steve Jobs announced the iPhone, and I was like, oh, I'm like, wait a minute. Like, this is coming fast. And so what we did is our tech team, we got iPhones 1 for everybody on the company, like immediately. Like we all ended up with iPhones like by week 2. I remember somebody was in the office after waiting online, on that ridiculous line the first day, and we're looking through it. It was like so cool. You got the map and you could zoom in with your 2 fingers, like you could squeeze, or like it was crazy. And we were like, there's going to be apps on this in the future. And so myself and a couple of the other tech folks, we jailbroke our iPhones and started like downloading illegal apps like that weren't like, not illegal, but they weren't like certified they weren't in the App Store. They were just like installing them directly to the Unix core that was underneath the iPhone operating system. And so we practiced creating apps and installing apps before the App Store came out, so that when it did come out, we were in the first, it was probably the first 100 apps. I might be wrong about that. It might have been a little bit like 200 apps, whatever, but like one of the first apps. And we had 10,000 restaurants signed up at the time we did it. And so like, you know, the business was already growing fast, but that was like, it was like just pouring like gasoline on the fire. It took off like crazy at that point.
That's really interesting. So I think at one point you were in the top 100 apps for a while when it came out, you were saying, right?
Well, we were in the first 100 apps to be released.
To be released.
We were definitely in the top 100
yeah.
when we released the app, just by virtue of existing.
And so I want to go into that thing you said a second ago, which was when you first thought of it, you thought that's going to be a really clunky experience. It's going to be text message based. And in your head, and I would feel exactly the same if I was you at that time, you'd say, well, it's so much easier just to pick up the phone and call them and say, send me a pepperoni pizza or whatever.
Yeah.
Right. But often when you're looking forward, you don't know a better experience until someone's made it. So like Uber is a great example where you would be on the street and the original Uber was supposed to be kind of luxury and like it was higher cost than a normal like yellow cab or something like that. Well, it's in San Francisco, so like whatever, a regular car ride. And most of the time, even then, people would say, well, the same things I said before. What if the person kidnaps you? What if? And so I'm curious, like, you know, was it just enough for Steve Jobs to be the validation for you to say, oh, no, like he knows what he's doing. They know what they're doing. Because I want to go into that idea of like being able to see something that doesn't exist yet. Yeah. Because that is quite a hard skill I think you kind of train yourself to do it in some ways. But I'm curious, like if there was something in particular, because like you said, there was a BlackBerry that was like internet enabled, and you know most people use it for like the BBM Messenger and email. But I'm curious, like, was it before you even started playing around with it, or was it once you started like hacking away and seeing, oh, this is the capability, we can zoom in and we can do XYZ on the device itself?
I think it's hard to pinpoint an exact moment because there's a paradox in creating a new business model or just creation generally. Well, being an entrepreneur and creating a business, and you have to have enough arrogance to be able to say something is wrong with the world and I alone can fix it and make it better. But you also have to be able to say, my customers like or don't like this thing, and I was wrong about it. So you have to hold these two ideas in tension, that like you have this vision that nobody else can see, and you have to be open to feedback. You have to have enough humility to like actually hear people. And so there was a moment of like, I was charging along on our online ordering platform, and then an investor sort of hit me from the side and said, hey, have you thought about this thing? And my initial reaction was like, no, we're doing this thing. We're doing the first thing. And I had to like stop and be like, wait, maybe he's right. And there was a few data points. There was my investor said it. There was the Steve Jobs like Apple keynote, you know, and there was a report by an investor called Mary Meeker that talked about the future of mobile. There was like all these data points, and I was like, oh, I was wrong. But then once I decided I was wrong, I switched. It was like a switch flipped. And I was like, okay, now I see a world where people use their phone, but the app they use the least on their phone is the phone app. They use everything else. They don't want to, because people have said to me from before day one until like yesterday, and we'll say 10 years from now, I don't see what the big problem is. Why don't you just pick up a phone and call a restaurant? And I just like, my head explodes. Like, it's a huge problem. People don't want to talk to other people on the phone. And there's inaccuracies, and it takes time, and it's insecure, and there's all these other things that are wrong with it. And so there was that flip, though. There was that moment where I was like, okay, like this is the future. And so now we need to go along that path. And it can be hard. It can be hard to abandon something that you were already being successful at and switch over to something new.
Yeah, I'm curious to ask that moment you said where, you know, Steve Jobs comes on stage, you see this wow thing, and you're like, okay, this is a big deal. This is going to change things. Are there other times, but outside of just like Grubhub, I'm just curious, as someone who's a technologist and someone who follows a lot of this stuff for a long time, were there other inflection points? And even now, if you're looking ahead, we're like, oh, wow, this is a new thing, and I see the potential. It might just be, you know, the ones we all kind of know, like AI and, you know, VR and stuff like that. But I'm curious, from your point of view, are there others since then that you've seen as like, wow, this is going to be another thing that feels very different?
Yeah, my current company Fixer is addressing a problem like this. So at this point in 2022, we all expect to be able to use our phone as a remote control for our lives. And so anywhere where that's not true is a place that's ripe for disruption. So that's definitely true in anything related to home repair or maintenance or getting a tradesperson into your home to do work. You have to go on a marketplace, you have to make phone calls. Like it looks a lot like food ordering did in 2002. And so like my new business is trying to solve that. Now, this business is a lot more challenging in terms of a marketplace business in the sense that there just aren't enough skilled tradespeople to do the work in the United States. And most of the trade schools have closed. And so we took this business model is based on the idea of full-time employees that have benefits that we train from scratch, as opposed to like a contractor model like Uber or Grubhub uses for their drivers. And so that's the new business that I'm doing. And I swear when I talk to investors and I'm like, yes, we're going to employ 40,000 full-time employees with benefits to create a massively scaled, great experience for customers in their home and open an entry path into the trades in a gender inclusive way. Like when I say that, the investors, like they stopped listening when I said full-time employee. Like,
yeah.
and to be honest, like I created a multi-billion-dollar business from scratch. Like investors take my calls and they're like, you're crazy, Mike. It's never going to happen. And I'm like, oh, I must really be onto something here. If everybody thinks it's crazy, it means it's going to take until I prove it to work before the competition is going to show up. So like I get a head start. Like this is great. It is annoying that investors are hard to convince, but that's always true.
Fair enough. But I don't want to go too far off track on the new company, but I'm curious to ask specifically about the full-time versus contractor approach, because that seems to be a huge differentiation point. So like, what was the key insight that made you say that is the way to do it versus how everyone else has been doing it since?
The key insight is that the quality matters. And so training matters. And if you're going to invest in getting people skills, you really want them to stick around and continue doing work for you. So we decided to make it a really good job that people liked, where we trained from scratch. So the experience in the home is good experience. Like, we show up, we put a mask on, we put booties on, we do the work well, we clean up after ourselves. And then when it's done, we just leave and your credit card gets charged, like similar to like with an Uber, getting out of the Uber and walking away was a great innovation, as opposed to negotiating with the cab driver about cash versus credit card. Nobody likes that conversation. Yeah. Right.
And that makes sense. And in a similar kind of moment, I know I've heard like Travis, the founder of Uber, talk about that moment where once you've done that the first time, and then similar to what you said, 0 to 1, 1 to 1 again, the second time you do it, I think he said, that's when you're like, oh, wow, okay, I'm never going back to a cab again, when now I could just leave. How many times, I don't know if you guys use regular cabs in Chicago much, but if I go in a yellow cab now, I often will like leave the cab and almost forget to pay because I'm just so used to the Uber experience, right? So, and then you have someone chasing you down the street. But so that's interesting. I do think that's a really interesting insight, and I completely agree, because having used what is the site where you get like help, but it's not just a TaskRabbit I'm thinking of. So I've had people come and fix stuff or like put stuff up or clean my place from TaskRabbit, but they're not specialized, first of all, so there's just like a generic group of people a lot of the time, and two, the quality isn't that consistent. So I think that's where hopefully like marketplace features like reviews and community and stuff can help. But if you're actually having that as part of your OKRs, right, like for the quarter, like we need to make sure the satisfaction of people is at X amount, and you're specifically working in a certain category, I can see that why that might work over time if you can get the economics to work. So just to go back to the story here though, so the App Store hits, you guys start developing that product. Where does this like big growth moment happen for you? Because it sounds like by that point it already was quite huge growth. And what were the key kind of levers for growth at this point? Was it literally just people making calls and convincing people to join your network, or was it user behavior and this kind of like flywheel effect? I'm just curious from your point of view.
Yeah, so the growth was never like, it was never like 500% year over year. It was pretty steadily 80% year over year for 14 years, right?
Wow.
So like,
Okay.
like that's really like, if you take 80% compounding growth and you have it over a long period of time, you end up with a huge business. But it wasn't, there are other businesses that are flashier in terms of their growth rate, right? Groupon certainly grew faster than we did, but they plateaued, whereas we just kept on going. The key levers were, we had loyal customers already. People stayed with us for years. That one of the key things was, is the experience so much better that they order more frequently than they did before they found us. So instead of ordering delivery once a month, do they now order once a week just because we've removed so much friction from the process? Are we actually increasing the size of the industry? So that was number one, is do customers stick around with us? And number two was, do restaurants stick around? Are the products that we're delivering, that was a pun, I didn't mean it to be, but like,
Yeah.
what's our attrition rate? How many restaurants cancel every month? And that, like, the closer that number is to zero, the better product we're delivering. And those two things, like, if you don't have to do a new sale to either side of a marketplace and they both just keep coming back again and again and again, the business just it's a juggernaut. It just doesn't slow down. It doesn't speed up either. It just goes at this 80% year-over-year growth rate forever. And that's what we had pulled off.
That's amazing. And so, what about acquisitions? Because was that another area for you to grow at some point? Because I don't know the full story with Seamless specifically, because I'm on East in New York. So when I first moved here in 2012 or 13, I used Seamless like from day one, and it was like my go-to delivery app. So what was, from what I read, there was a merger or something like that. So but I didn't get the full story there. So what happened with Seamless specifically?
Yeah, I talked a little bit about this in the book, so we acquired Campus Food. That allowed us to get from 50 cities into 350, and then we did a merger with Seamless. And the story behind it was this: it really was down to, we were down to hours away from filing to go public, like hours. It was
Okay.
We had the lawyer sitting across from the SEC in New York. Like, we were ready to go in when we were like in the final negotiations with Seamless around a merger. And really what it came down to is, you didn't just move to New York, you moved to Manhattan. I know you did, if you're using Seamless, because we actually beat Seamless in Brooklyn and Hoboken. It was only Manhattan. And so we had blocked them from pretty much every other city in the United States, but they had more orders in Manhattan than we had in the rest of the country combined. Like, it was that much.
That's really interesting.
In Manhattan. And
do you know what's crazy? Can I add to validate what you said? You're right, because I was in Manhattan at the time. Now I'm in Brooklyn. But I remember I'm pretty sure I tried using Grubhub, because I'd used it on like the West Coast. I don't know where I'd used it, but maybe it was even in Chicago actually, because I'd come to Chicago before I moved there for work. And maybe I'd like done it in my hotel or something. And when I moved there, I was like, oh, let me use Grubhub again. And then I remember this girl on my team being like, Grubhub? No, we use Seamless here. And I was like, oh, okay. And I was like, why? Are there better restaurants on here or what? And she was just like, yeah, it's just the one that like New Yorkers use here. And I was like, okay, that's kind of a funny statement. But now in hindsight, like, I love that you knew I was actually in Manhattan. So that's interesting.
And it mattered because with the IPO, all the investment bankers are in Manhattan. And so even though we were bigger and we had wider scale and we had more opportunity for growth, the investment bankers knew Seamless and they didn't know Grubhub. And so it would have made the price of the public stock terrible, simply because the investment bankers were like, well, who's Grubhub? I know Seamless. And so like, they had basically blocked us from a great IPO by being in Manhattan, and we had blocked them from a great IPO by keeping them out of everywhere else. And so the merger made sense from a dollars and cents perspective, from a which company is innovating faster, which one has higher growth perspective, which one, like, I felt pretty strongly like we could just outcompete them if we just worked another 3 or 4 years solo. And so there's a huge debate. Like, this is a huge debate in the book. I have like a whole chapter where we're fighting back and forth about, I didn't want to do the merger. And then my partner and the other board members, like there's like 3 board members on each side of the argument. It's a pretty dramatic chapter, I think.
Yeah. That's amazing.
In the end, we decided to do it. In the end, I decided it was best for my employees, the employees of the company, to do the merger before going through the IPO.
I love that. So I just want to call back to one of the things you said there about the investment bankers not knowing the brand, and just or like knowing Seamless versus Grubhub. Like, it reminds me a little bit of like in advertising world, when you're doing like a outdoor campaign or something like that, you often will go and buy, like people do this, they will buy billboards where executives live. Like if they know in like Palo Alto or whatever, like the Google or Facebook execs are living there, or Cupertino for Apple, and they're running a big campaign, they make sure they're going to see it 50 times a day when they drive up and down the highway, right? And so that is an interesting idea about how the modern version of that, right? Because, you know, that was something that happened some time ago, but the lesson still remains. Like sometimes, like one person is not always the same as another person in terms of their awareness and their, you know, ability to help you in a way. So that's a very interesting anecdote. I'd never heard that one before. So let's talk about the IPO real quick. So what was at this point, you was already a very successful company, right? In terms of scale. There was an eventual IPO, right? After the merger?
Yeah. So I ran the merger it took about 10 months to get through, well, really probably like 14 months to get through the entire, like the approval from regulatory bodies, and then do the actual merger, and then line up to do another IPO. And so then in 2014, we had an IPO. And then 28 days later, I punted it and rode my bicycle across the United States. I left the company and like rode off into the sunset. That's
great. All right. So we're going to get to that moment. And just to clarify for people want to know numbers on here. This is all public anyway. So Grubhub IPO value, put it around $2 billion. Is that about right?
I think it was 2.6.
Okay, cool.
The stock price was $40.25 on the first trade.
Okay,
so remember that to the day I die.
I'm sure you will. And so, again, without, you know, like the reason I ask these questions is not because I want to know how rich you are. We already know you're rich, right? You had a successful company and an exit in a good way. More so for people who ever go through this process and kind of lessons learned. When you have a successful exit like that, I think a lot of people don't realize like how much a percentage share dilutes over time, especially for venture capital backed companies. And so the only proxy I have in a similar category, I think, was DoorDash. And this is off the top of my head, so I could be completely off. But without remembering the value of the company, the market cap, I remember one of the founders had like 6% of the company or something like that by the time it went public.
Yeah, I had like 2.
You had 2, exactly.
Yeah, so I had like 2%.
Okay, so either way, a great exit and life-changing money. Hopefully,
it's great. Everyone should do it.
Everyone should do it, exactly.
Yeah.
And so, you know, after that moment, you pretty much don't have to work on paper again if you don't want to. In most ways, for money anyway. Is there anything you would have done differently in terms of how that netted out? Whether that is related to your own equity, or you know, your employees, or anything else through that process? Because I think more than 50% of people I've interviewed on it all regret stuff that happened through the venture capital process. And it doesn't always mean they had a bad exit. It just means, like, one of them's coming to mind, founder of FanDuel, Nigel Eccles. His company was worth over $1 billion at one point, sold for 500 million, and he made 0 because it was like a down round or whatever, down valuation. Another guy had an $80 million offer and he got blocked by the board. And, you know, now he made 0 from it as well. So those are the kind of like crazy high stakes that you're playing in this world. So I'm curious, with that context, like, is there anything similar that comes to mind for you?
So it's interesting because you started out the question by talking about it being successful, and then you talk about what the regrets are. But even when you said, I think you said success like 10 times as you asked that question. And one of the things you said was success in terms of dollars. Yeah. And so you even defined your term success in that conversation. And I think it's actually an incredibly important point that, like, people think I was successful because I had an IPO, or they think I'm successful because I made a lot of money. Like, people think will ascribe their own values towards what success is. But I think I was successful because I created a business that helped 70,000 independent restaurants against large corporate chains, regardless of whether, like, I paid off my school debt, the cash, like, I overshot, right? It wasn't about the money by the time I was only like 3 or 4 years into the business. And so if I had, I'm trying to answer your question. It's a long way to get about it. And so when I think about like regrets, they have to be compared against what my personal definition of success was, which was, I want a company that has a positive impact in the communities in which it operates. Like, once you make enough money to like pay off your school debt and pay for a house, everything beyond that is like, I don't want to buy an island. I'm not that kind of, like, who cares? Right. Like everything else was gravy. And so any sort of changes that I would make are related to, is there a way that I could have created mission lock in the company where we are focused exclusively on independently operated restaurants and not chains, right? If I could have done that, like back in 2006, I think it would have been great. And it would have set the company up for long-term differentiation in a way that has largely gone away these days. And so when I think back, what I think about what I would do differently, or what maybe, since I don't have a time machine, what I can advise other people to do who are in the present, it's be thoughtful about what your goals are and think about the reality that they're going to change. If you're successful, they're going to get changed and they're going to get bigger. So start with the bigger goals. Start by thinking big about what it is you want to accomplish. Like by applying that idea to Fixer, my new company, we want to reboot trade education in the United States in a gender inclusive way, right? Like that's our big, ridiculous goal. It isn't about the money. Like companies make money as an incidental secondary thing. Like it's not the point of being a company. The point of being a company is to create value for customers, and you just happen to get paid for it, right? But companies that think like we're only exist to make money, they actually don't always serve customers very well. But companies that serve customers really well almost always make money, right? So, so my regrets are related to like mission and vision and goals, not related to like, I liked the VCs I worked with. They were great.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting. No, I think that's actually a great reframe of what I was saying. And to be fair, when I normally talk about success, I'm most of the time not talking about money as well. So I definitely agree with your point.
How do you define success? Wait, hold on. Now I'm going to ask you a question.
Yeah. Let's do it. You can interview me. So how do I define success? My simple answer, and I think first of all, it's different for everyone, but for me personally, it is doing the things, essentially living a good life, doing the things that you choose to do, spending the time doing the things that you want to do, whether that is creating a company, working at a nonprofit, being someone who looks after the kids, which is another version of living a great life, or all of the above, but being intentional about it and optimizing towards what you care about at that particular moment. And ideally that is beyond just yourself, right? But I think a lot of the time some people jump to that part, which is like, I need to save the world. And as someone, I know we're going to maybe talk about this, as someone who also left, a place like Google to go and work at a nonprofit, which I thought was a great experience. I loved it. But I met a lot of like very idealistic young people who would like point fingers at like all the bad in the world, but then not necessarily always have the solutions for it. And so like, I think sometimes you need to figure out, like, get your house in order. And I think that then can progress to, now I need to make sure I can look after my family. Now, all right, I'm in a stage mentally and in a place where I'm able to do this from a proactive, positive place to be. But that isn't always the case. Sometimes you're so pissed off about a problem and you go and fix it. And I respect that too. I'm just saying, for me in particular, I think when I'm proactive and like coming from it in an attacking point of view versus defensive, that's when I do my best work. Because it's positive and moving in the right direction. When I'm like scared or I have to do this, that's not where I do my best work or where I feel the best. So that was a long way of saying, I think it really changes. And for me right now, it's been, I don't have kids at the moment. And it has been, how can I spend my time doing the things I want to do every day and prioritizing the things I need to prioritize. Right now, that has been my health and being able to spend as much time as I can on prioritizing that and making it number one priority. In 5 years' time, if I had kids, health should still be way up there, but I'll have a joint
It gets harder.
Thing. Exactly.
Trust me.
Exactly. So
it gets harder. Kids take a lot of time.
I'm sure. Yeah. So that's kind of, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of how I.
No, it's really interesting. And you even said something that I think resonates with the message that I have in the book. And even what I just said about thinking bigger is, one of the, I think let me just try and see if I can reframe a little bit what you just said. This idea that like, you can't think about saving the world until you have your own house in order, I think is what you said. And like the idea that it happens in concentric circles where it's like, you have to figure out your own sense of success. And then those people around you, before you can think globally, Like you have to think locally before you can think
You
globally.
could do, but yeah, okay,
Yeah.
that's fair.
It's interesting because I'm encouraging people to think bigger, because when I think backwards and I see where I was, I wish I had bigger plans. I had bigger goals. Bigger goals in terms of how I define success, in terms of creating impact in the communities that I work in. But I had to pay off that school loan. Like it was really hard to think about the world while I was in debt.
That's kind of what I mean by, and just to be more specific about that, that doesn't mean you can't do very meaningful, positive work from day one. I'm just saying the people I'm thinking of from a practical point of view, who some of my best friends who essentially like maybe are doing like positive work on paper, but like it comes from quite a negative place, and it comes from quite a place of like, those people are bad and we need to fight against those people, or you know, it's quite hard to say without going to specifics, without like calling out someone that is their private life. So but you know, and so that's kind of, and I think that's what,
which of your friends are you talking about? I'm kidding. You know?
Well, I'd say like with entrepreneurship, that's kind of what has always been very interesting to me, is by definition, the greatest truth in a way is someone giving you something they worked hard for something that you've created. Yeah. Right. And like, and that's kind of, I know that is a very simplistic way of looking at it, but that's why I always just think money, especially coming from Europe, people almost like look down on it as like, oh, well, you're such a Americanized person now, and you think that like money is like defines everything, which is definitely not the case. But I do also think, compared to an average European friend of mine, I think like money, sometimes you put your money where your mouth is, right? In most cases. So especially, let's say non-profit world, a lot of people that when I used to do work at a charity, my job was to convince big companies, and my team's job was to partner with big companies and small companies and like raise money and awareness about this cause that we're working on. And that worked really, really well. But when we would do stuff in Europe, I was kind of reminded of my like past a little bit, and people would say, oh yeah, I really want to help, but I'm not going to give money, and how can I come and volunteer? Which is a great idea, and I'd love people to want to do that, and people should volunteer. Now the problem was the work we were doing was in the developing world, and you weren't able to go and volunteer because it would be a burden for us to support you when you're not a skilled person in what we need to get done. And so sometimes the best thing for charity is to get money in most cases, because then we can then hire the right people to work 10 times faster than a random volunteer would be. So again, that's like a long way of saying I think there's a certain truth in a transaction, and whether that is a donation or it is buying your product or ordering a pizza on Seamless, I've signaled to the world, I prefer this behavior of sitting on my ass and ordering a pizza this way than calling the person on the phone, because I put my money where my mouth was. And I think that we're kind of getting to a place sometimes nowadays where we talk a lot about things people want versus just looking at the behavior. And that includes, so that's kind of how, that's the bigger topic, but that is kind of how I was thinking of it when you asked that question.
So you mentioned, I literally have, I'm going to quote myself from the book, which is a little bit hokey, but I have a line in the book where I say, you know, I'm cranky in the book. I'm a cranky person. And I say, everything around me is shit and it could be better. And the difference between, so that person is a miserable grump. The difference between that person and an entrepreneur is saying everything around me is shit and it could be better. And I'm can do it.
Yeah.
I'm going to do it. Like that's the difference between being a grump and being an entrepreneur. But entrepreneurs, I don't think, are typically happy people, because they're saying the world is broken and they're trying to go fix it. Now they may be fulfilled people, but you start from a place of recognizing a problem.
Well, you see the world like that, right? You're looking at problems around you. And like you said, there's a difference between someone who would just complain about the problem and someone who will go and try to make a solution for it and fix it, or at least make it better. And that's kind of what the essence of the podcast is the word creator I've been using since before the creator economy. People kind of hijacked it. It was anyone who creates something, whether that was a business, a nonprofit, a piece of artwork, whatever it was, a movement. That is kind of what I love to think about, because I think it has the greatest impact in many ways, and has an overlap with my interests, of course. And it allows people, both on an individual basis and a wider society basis, to improve things. And so that is kind of that's kind of the idea behind the podcast. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I like that deviation there, like what we just talked about. Did that answer your question first of all on the
Yeah, because
happiness?
you even just said that you talk to people that you enjoy talking to. You say how you want to spend your time. So you're, by your own definition, you're successful.
But so that exactly. So to go into that, I wrote this out, right? Like I wrote this out in 2014 or 2015. I went through a big exercise. I was working at Google. I was kind of depressed. I didn't have a green card, so I couldn't leave my job without like leaving the country. And I was like, I need to do something else. I need to like move myself in a direction. And I basically wrote out certain things which were, and look, don't get me wrong, I don't have it perfect right now either, right? But one of the things I said was, what are things I like doing where I spend my time and just time just flies? And like those are the things I naturally like doing. And one of the top things I like doing is meeting interesting people and understanding how things work. And especially as someone who's creative and entrepreneurial, where I didn't also grow up with like knowing a bunch of entrepreneurs. I had to go and ask random people, hey, how does this stuff work? And growing up, that wasn't, people would always just be like, oh, well, don't ask them how that works. Like my parents, for example, were amazing, but they were very much like, don't ask people about money. Like that's kind of like rude. And for me, it was never about like knowing how much someone earned. It was just understanding new ways of doing things and like what are things I can borrow from that person's life. And so that essentially is what Creator Lab became, right? It's just me being curious and letting people into that conversation. So that was a part of it. Then of course there's a practicality. How do I pay for my rent? How do I make sure I have enough money in the bank? How do I do the things financially that I need to do? And then the other thing for me in the last few years was time. And it was, how do I get rid of all the stuff that I generally don't like to do and at least minimize it? So in my current work, I do about 1 day of that a week, like maybe half a day.
That's about as good as you can get.
Exactly.
Nobody likes their job 4 out of 5 out of 5 days.
Yeah, exactly. And
4 out of 5 is great.
Yeah, I'm working, I'm doing podcasts, I'm doing other stuff I enjoy, but that 1 day a week, I'm fine with doing it because that is a trade-off, but that is kind of the balance I have. So I think whatever that balance is to someone else is happy and successful to me. But anyway, I know we've got about 13 minutes left, so I do want to get on to some other stuff here. But thanks for that question. It was very thoughtful, and I like that tangent. Let's talk about, you left in 2014. You had this big moment. It was after the IPO. So I'm assuming you were able to, normally after an IPO, is there like a time you need to stay there to keep as much of the money as possible? Isn't that a thing?
Yeah, there's like you don't have to be at the company, but there's a 6-month lockup where you can't sell the stock.
You can't sell it. Okay, yeah. So by that point, you secured the bag, as they say, and you're able to...
No, I left 28 days after the IPO. I still have 5 months left on my earnout.
Damn. Okay. That's interesting. Okay.
I punted it, but I had sold some stock prior to the IPO to a private equity company. So I paid off my school debt. I wasn't like crazy rich, but I had no more debt, which was my whole original goal. And so it just didn't make sense to stay at the company if my goals, which were to help the community in which the company operated, which in this case was independent restaurants. I really didn't think that was going to be the goal of the company going forward as they were public. And so I went separate ways. I didn't leave because I was like burnt out or didn't have anything left to contribute. I left because my goals I could no longer see how they aligned with where the company was headed. And so I decided to put my energy elsewhere. But part of that was going on this ridiculous bike trip.
That's wild.
Yeah.
Okay, so I didn't know about and so I want to talk about the bike trip, but again, people listening to this are asking me to ask you this. So without going in detail, or if you want to go into details, it's up to you. Like you got out of debt, but you've worked all these years and you have this big, successful on paper exit financially. Is that not something you just think, I want to, regardless of the situation, I need to see this out for the next 12 months or whatever it might be left? Because it sounds like quite a big difference from what you said.
Yes, I left the company and there was a 9-digit figure of stock, cash, like that I would get for the stock that I just left. And I was like, well, the stock will either be worth something or not in 6 months, whatever. It's not aligned with my goals. I pay off my debt. I have enough cash to live on for a few years. Like I'll be fine.
Okay. That's fair.
And so like I wasn't, that wasn't important to me. And even I could even have stayed and like been earning equity, right? And so I had this argument with one of the investors, not an argument. When I decided to leave, they said, well, over the next year, you're gonna like vest like millions of dollars, a couple $1 million worth of stock. Like, why? How can you not do 1 year of work for $2 million? You're crazy. And I was like, I don't need it. Like, what? Why would I waste? I only have 45 years of life left. Why would I waste 2% of that? Like, if I don't need the cash, because the one thing I can't get more of is time.
Yeah.
And so it just, the venture capitalist I was talking to could not understand that argument, just couldn't grasp why you would not take the cash.
Yeah. And I guess my point on this is always, there's always more, right? Like in a year's time, there's going to be more again. You would have vested more stuff and you would have like, essentially, like you said, earned more equity by being there or whatever. And like it is, like even on my scale, like leaving Google and a lot of my friends who are still there, speaking to them, right? Like there's this phrase like golden handcuffs, right? And like the reason why 90% of my friends are still there is because of golden handcuffs. I'm not against them doing that. That's up to them. But if you log in, in the Google interface and you see go/stock or whatever it is, and you look and it's like $1 million sitting there, and you're going to leave and you're going to lose that. That is quite a hard thing to do. So I'm curious, like, to go into that a tiny bit more. Was it as simple as saying I don't need this and something else is calling my name, or was there like a conversation in your head that might be helpful for someone else to replay when they get into this position?
I think that there's a concept that goes hand in hand with golden handcuffs, which is I'm going to be miserable now so that in the future I can be happy. And it's never, ever, ever true. If you don't choose to be happy now, you will never choose to be happy. It will always be in the future. And so I think it's really important to not buy into the lie of the deferred happiness life.
Yeah. Okay.
And even
is this a similar idea to like regret minimization framework? Is that a similar thing or not?
I don't know what that is. It sounds
it's like a Jeff Bezos. It's a Jeff Bezos thing where he's talked about it. But all right, let's go back to it. What you're saying.
But I've heard this concept of like, you do a startup and you work 100 hours a week doing something you kind of don't really like because you're going to get a big payday. And then what? And then you'll be happy. Like you'll be content. Like it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Yeah. You have to choose contentment by being present. You can't. Yeah. It's never a thing that's coming tomorrow. It's like the diet that you're going to start on Monday. You don't ever actually start on Monday. Yeah. You got to start now. There's something very powerful about now that is it never shows up a day from now. And I think that was true in my situation as I was leaving the company. Like I had a big payday. I wasn't really giving up that much in the sense that like, arguably what would I have done staying there for another year aside from just vesting options? Would I really have made it more successful, the company more likely to be successful? I don't think so, because at the time, the value of the company had a lot more to do with what Kramer said on Mad Money and what retail investors just happened to think that day. And it was just crazy. Like there was almost no relationship between the value of the company and how it was performing. And so I'm like, well, what does sticking around help? Like I might as well like peace out and go enjoy my life. And think about what it is I want to spend my time and energy on for my next thing. I'm obviously not retiring. I'm too young for that. So I had to think about,
how old were you at this stage? Sorry, when you
2014, I would have been 38. I think. Is that right?
And so this is great. So in that moment where you're thinking of what to do next, like what was going through your mind to figure out? So you've decided you're not doing what you're currently doing, but figuring out what you are going to do is kind of the second part to that act. So like I've gone through this a few times myself, and I'm just curious, like how did you think about what that moment should be? And it ended up being this big bike trip across the US, but like what were the other options and how did you kind of come to that conclusion?
So there's a thing that happens when you're intentional about your goals and intentional about defining success. And success is more than just a goal. Success is an accumulation of a lot of goals over a long period of time. And there's a thing that happens that's kind of a raw deal, which is if you make your goal hard enough and if you make the thing you're shooting for big enough, as you approach it, if you actually are successful in approaching it, it changes you, because all of that hard work, like you have to think, you have to adapt, you have to grow, you have to learn. And as a result of changing, you might, this I think is a fairly common experience. As you approach the finish line, you're a different person than the person who set the finish line in the first place. And so it moves. And so you don't ever like actually get it. Like the finish line sort of recedes into the sunset constantly, this is kind of an opposite of the idea of what I just said, that happiness is never coming in the future. But the reality is that if you really truly are setting hard goals for yourself and you're growing, it becomes not just the destination, but the journey. And I know that's trite. Like a lot of people have said that. And I'm not saying it's not the destination, but the journey. I'm saying it's both. And so that's what the bike trip was for me is, okay, I want to reflect. I want to think about what I did. I want to set the next set of big goals. But for this trip by itself, I have a much more mundane goal. Well, the first one was get across the country, get to the Pacific. But there was like an emotional one too, which was like decompress, relax, like just stop stressing out about things so much. But halfway through the trip, I was relaxed. And so it actually ended up becoming about, I met two friends who were from London and they became good friends. And I ended up spending 24/7 with them for the second half of the trip.
How long was
and it
the
became
trip
about
total?
developing relationships.
How long was the trip total?
It was 3 months.
3 months. Nice.
Yeah.
That's awesome, man. And so
go ahead.
So could I just ask a quick question? Because one of the things I had in my notes here was like during a lot of this, I don't know if this was near the IPO or before or after, but there was a near collapse of your marriage. And so just, I'm curious, like on a personal basis, like, well, first of all, when was that? And I'm curious if that had anything to do with like how that plays into like taking this trip. Was it solo? And I know you just said you met friends on the way, but I'm just curious how like your personal marriage might have played into this as well.
Yeah. The trip was great for my marriage, and my wife was very supportive of it. And she was really happy I was going to go decompress and stuff like that. The challenges were when my goals and my success were in conflict with other people I was in relationship with, and, specifically my wife, she had goals related to being an international human rights lawyer, which really probably should have taken us to The Hague or Geneva. And I was running a startup in Chicago. And so like those two things were in conflict. And I won that conflict, right? Like we stayed, and
You're still in Chicago.
And her career suffered. And it's such a typical story. And it's such a gendered story as well. And it was really hurtful. And so that's what really caused the challenges in the marriage. There was like the big ideas. And then there's just the day-to-day of when you work 20 hours and you get home, or you work a long week, or you have an investor call that you have to take when you're supposed to be having a dinner. Those little frustrations, those little paper cuts, they accumulate. And so there was something about just being in charge for that long and having oddly being in charge meant other people had a lot of obligation, like a lot of say on where I spent my schedule. I had a lot of obligation on me. It just caused like it's a long-term high friction thing to do to a relationship. Yeah,
for sure. And sorry, I didn't mean to cut off your story about traveling, because that's really, really cool. So you did that for 3 months. And kind of what happened after that? Was there, again, like a now decompressed moment? You're back to Chicago, back with the family. What was the kind of process to figure out that next step that led to, I guess, Fixer.com was the next thing, but maybe there was something in between. I'm not sure.
Yeah. So I came out of the bike trip with a very strong conviction that I wanted to do something that helped create economic mobility for individuals. At the time, I thought there was something related to small businesses versus like box stores coming out of the bike trip, but it eventually became more about creating an entry path into the trades. In between, there was the not small moment of I brought my daughter home from the hospital. And so I stayed at home as a dad for 2.5 years, for the first 2.5 years of my daughter's life. Before I started like talking to investors and really some of the first, there was 3 of us that were in the first 100 people at Grubhub that we started this new company together. And so there was a time where I actually did just like have a different set of goals. And then the other thing I tried to do, so I tried to start a science fiction career. So I wrote a couple of science fiction novels.
Oh, wow.
Total failure. Like I'm thoughtful about defining success, and the things that I defined for myself, I met none of those goals. It was a total disaster. And so actually I ended up saying, well, I'm trying to create a writing career and I have a lot of things to say. I've had moderate success with science fiction, or minimal rather.
Yeah.
But I've gotten a lot of practice in writing. So maybe I'll write a book. And so in addition to starting Fixer, I decided to start thinking about writing this book. And I sold the book to Hachette pretty much right then. And then started the process of writing it 2.5 years ago as I was starting the Fixer. I just had started Fixer. And so that was what happened in between. It's all connected. Like, obviously.
No, that's awesome, man. And yeah, it sounds very cliche to say, but like the famous Steve Jobs things of you connect the dots after in hindsight. Like you can see, oh, well, this happened. I started writing science fiction, but then ended up being this book that you've now written, essentially. So I know we're hitting time. I could probably speak to you for another hour and a half, 2 hours doing this. So I really appreciate you coming on. I know the book is coming out, I think, early November, right?
Is it November 2nd? It should be up for sale. It's on Audible if you want to listen to the audiobook, or you can get it Kindle or hardcover. So
that is out. By the time people listen to this, it would already be out. So you can go, and I'll add a link in the show notes. People can go and click through and check out the book. Really highly recommend the story. So thanks for being on the show, man. I really appreciate you opening up, being so honest. And yeah, this was a lot of fun, man. Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot for having me on, Bilal.
Thanks, Mike. All right, see you next time. Bye-bye.